Not yet. Good. All right. Good evening and welcome to worship at Patchwork Central. Welcome to those who are here in person and welcome to those of you who are joining us online. A couple of things to get started with. If you are joining us online and you wish, please write your name in the comments section so that we know that you're here and joining us. You can also put in the comments section any prayer requests, joys or concerns, also any announcements for the good of the Patchwork community. And also so you know, just as we do every Sunday evening during our worship, we do celebrate the Eucharist, the communion. So if you want to now, you can grab your elements, a little bit of bread or cracker, wine or juice, whatever your elements are. So Helen Templeton is joining us and Erica Shipley. So welcome to both of you. In just a moment, we are going to go around and say our names, but I'm also going to ask, if you wish, and you don't have to, because we are talking tonight about Epiphany, about the coming of the Magi, about these wise men or sorcerers or whatever they might have been who were seeking knowledge about this star and what it meant for the world. I'm just going to ask, if you want, you can share a brief story about any time that you undertook a journey for knowledge of any kind. It can be a literal journey, a figurative journey, whatever you want, just you were seeking some bit of knowledge. And so I'll start and I'll tell a little story and give you a little time to think of yours if you want. So when I was 7 years old, my family lived in Idaho. We lived in Boise, in the capital of Idaho, and we loved going out hiking and camping and going out into the wilderness. And little 7-year-old John loved animals. I loved going to the library and getting out as many books as I possibly could about animals. And one of the animals I loved were birds, and specifically birds of prey. And so my parents, knowing this, took us on a trip to the Snake River Canyon in Idaho, which is a wildlife preserve for birds of prey. And we went, and sure enough, you could see eagles, bald eagles, golden eagles. You could see different kinds of hawks and falcons and osprey. And I remember as a kid, you see the Snake River and you see the canyon walls, and an osprey who had made its nest in the canyon walls flew out and dove down to the Snake River and went fishing and caught itself a fish and flew back up to its home on the cliffs. So I was just, this was great, and I wanted to know even more. So I got back home and I read more, and I knew this, a 7-year-old John knew this fancy word, ornithology, study of birds. And so I looked up in the phone book, I looked up the local college, and I called the college and I asked for the ornithology department. And I actually got to talk to a professor, and I said, can I take a course so I can learn more about birds? And the professor said, how old are you again? I said, I'm 7. He said, no, you're a little too young. He said, but here, let me talk to your parents. And so I handed the phone over to my mom and dad. They talked to him a little bit, and they worked out a visit. So my parents drove me up to the university, and we walked into the ornithology professor's classroom, and I got to see all posters and all kinds of stuff. And then he even took me in the back where they had these drawers of taxidermied birds. And so I got to see stuffed birds. So that was my journey to learn about birds and birds of prey. So if you wish, again, say your name, and if you wish, a brief journey that you may have undertaken to seek knowledge. So I'm John, and that was my journey as a 7-year-old.
I'm Laura, and when I was little, I somehow heard about the story of Susanna and the elders in the Apocrypha, and I wanted to find out about it, and I looked in this huge family Bible that we had, a huge one that was just kept on the table, sort of for decoration in the living room. So I hunted up the story of Susanna and the elders, and I'm not sure, I had heard that it was something risque,
So Laura is with us, and Laura says that she took a journey to find out about the story of Susanna and the elders, which is in the Apocrypha of the Bible. And so she took out her big family Bible and looked it up, and because she had heard it was somewhat risque. So risque knowledge is a kind of knowledge.
I'm Jane, and I was in Hawaii at a conference, and I really wanted to climb Diamond Head. And at that point, there wasn't anybody who wanted to go do that, so I got myself on a tour bus and headed for Diamond Head, and the driver wanted to know why a woman about my age all by herself, and the only person on the bus was going to Diamond Head. I said, I want to go up there. My dad was here in World War II. And in fact, he came back here as he was going home. He said, well, take it easy. Well, it wasn't that hard to climb. It got a little hard, not too bad. Went up, and I looked over everywhere, the places where the machine guns had been put down and so forth, because people were afraid of invasion. And I came back down, and I realized I was running late. And so I started to speed walk down Diamond Head. And then I had to speed walk to where the bus stop was. And I was for sure I had missed it. And I got within vision of them, and I waved, well, they were looking the other way. But apparently they had been waiting for the old woman to come down the mountain. And when I got there, I said, oh, there you are. And they put me on the bus and took me home. So the knowledge was Diamond Head, but the real knowledge was people looking out for me.
So Jane is here, and she shared a story about when she was in Hawaii going up Diamond Head, where her father had been in World War II, and not only the knowledge of that place, but then when she came down the mountain, learning that the bus had waited for her and everybody was looking out for her and caring for her in that way. So that's good.
I'm Nils, and in 4th grade, we got a class project about Asia. And the rules were pretty simple. You had to have lots of pictures and lots of things, and of course a lot of my classmates went to magazines and cut out anything about Asia and stuff like that. My buddy and I decided we wanted to do something else. So we had heard about prehistoric people in the Orient, like the Java man and the Peking man. So we decided to do a little bit of finding out about early humans in Asia. And I discovered that my library card, red library card, and also had a B on it, B for children. So I had to go to the adult section to get reference books. So I put together a nice thing about prehistoric people in Asia, but the book, it was too short. So then how should we expand on this? And my buddy had heard about the Mongol Empire. So we went and had a second portion of it on Genghis Khan and the Mongol Empire. And that was sort of fun because it was a good report. We learned a lot. And I also learned something else. When you, in 4th grade, give a report on a research paper to parents and stuff like that, and you watch the parents' eyes glaze over when you give the report, and you realize that, yeah, this research thing is something I like to pursue.
So I can't quite do it justice, but I'll try to summarize. Nils tells the story of when he was in 4th grade and had an assignment to give a presentation to the class, not just to the class, apparently to parents also, about Asia. And he and his friend not only researched Asia, researched ancient peoples in Asia, Java man, Peking man, and then expanded beyond that and went into Genghis Khan and other things and had to go into the grown-up section of the library to find the reference materials to do so. So he learned all of that information, but then he also learned that when you're giving a research paper to adults and you keep going on and on and on about things, their eyes glaze over, and he thought that was a good thing. So he that was good. All right. Next.
I'm Amy, and I guess one thing I think of is during my study abroad time in Scotland, I decided that I wanted to see more of Scotland, but there weren't any of the other Americans or
So Amy is here, and she tells a little bit about the time when she was studying abroad in Scotland, and she wanted to see more of Scotland, but nobody else in the international housing wanted to do that, so she struck out on her own during Easter week, a week when the buses didn't, 2 weeks, weeks when the buses did not run, so she had to scrape and scrap and hitchhike and... buses weren't running full speed, so she had to find plenty of forms of alternative transportation. But she got to visit multiple places in the Outer Hebrides. So.
Well, I'm Karen, and I like to do Ancestry.com. And I got started really just because my sister had run across somebody at the restaurant where she worked who looked exactly like my uncle. And some other person said, we've got relatives in Wisconsin, which I had no idea about. So I just started that way, and I never did find out about that. But I ended up on one of my trips. We decided to go to the cruise up Norway, and I was able to stop in Trondheim and see, because we got a caddy at the dock, and see the house where my grandmother grew up. And that was just really cool.
Yeah. Karen is here, and tell us about the time that she and some other family members, did your sister go also? Or?
No, it was just my friend.
So she went and found her grandmother's house in Norway, which is...
Other relatives have also done that, so we've been able to get together.
Okay, other relatives have also done that, but this particular trip, they weren't there. So that sounds like a wonderful journey also. So I'm going to go, so Helen Templeton is here, Erica Shipley is here, Gail Lafif is here, Jane Staten is here, Jean is here, Elizabeth Sire is here, so we've got a good group of folks online. And once again, if you wish to share your stories in the comments, please feel free to do so. Celebrations, a little bit of a sad celebration. This week would have been Beth's birthday. Beth passed away, and we had a very nice obituary in the paper. I want to once again thank Jill Heminger for putting that together, and that was in the paper today. Epiphany, of course, is on January 6th. Are there other celebrations, birthdays or anniversaries this week? I learned about one that I find kind of interesting. You might too. So tomorrow, January 3rd, would have been the 130th birthday of J.R.R. Tolkien, famous author. And apparently, the Tolkien Society encourages you, if you wish to remember Professor Tolkien, that January 3rd, about 9 p.m., whatever local that time that is for you, to raise a glass in a toast, and the toast is simply the professor, and take a drink. So, if you wish to toast Tolkien tomorrow evening, please feel free to do that.
Well, we had a birthday.
Yeah.
Nils's birthday was the 25th. We celebrated the 25th. And that was all the 22 people or so that gathered around from, about 4 different states in the Union, including 3 young men, because one was a fiancé, one was a friend, and one was a friend's friend. But we all went to one big party, and we celebrated Nils as a youth.
Oh, great. So Nils's birthday was on the 25th, but celebrated on the 26th with family from 4 different states, and did it right. So had a great celebration. Fantastic. Any other celebrations? Okay. So as I said, we're going to talk about the visit of the Magi tonight. So the story is found in Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. And I decided to go ahead and do my own translation of this, and then you'll see how that fits in as I talk more about it. So listen for the word of God. In the days of Herod the king, Jesus having been born in Bethlehem of Judea, look, sorcerers from the lands of the rising sun arrived on the scene in Jerusalem, saying, "Where is the one who has been born King of the Judeans? For we perceived his star in the east and are come to do reverence to him." When King Herod heard this, he was agitated, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and religious scholars of the people, he was inquiring of them where the anointed one was to be born. In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it has been written through the prophet, and you, Bethlehem of the land of Judah, are by no means least among the chiefs of Judah, for out of you will go forth a chief who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod, having secretly summoned the sorcerers, ascertained from them the exact sequence of events of the star's manifestation. Then he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search with exactness for the child, and as soon as you have discovered him, send a report back to me, in order that I may also go and do reverence to him." Having heard the king, they journeyed out, and look, the star which they saw in the lands of the rising sun led them forth until, having arrived, it stopped over the place where the child was. Having discerned the star, they rejoiced with an exceedingly great joy. And coming into the house, they perceived the child with Mary his mother, and falling down on their knees, they did reverence to him. Then opening up their treasure stores, they presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been divinely instructed in a dream not to return to Herod, they withdrew to their own country by a different path. May God bless the reading and hearing of this word. Will you please join me in prayer? Oh God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts and minds be acceptable in your sight, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. I just noticed Natasha Hayes has also joined us, so we have a good online crew joining us for worship. So I think that when these magi, these wise men, arrived in Jerusalem, probably what would have taken them by surprise was how normal the city felt. They were expecting, well, they probably didn't know exactly what they were expecting, but it should not have been ordinary. It should have been different. But they get into Jerusalem, and the merchants are selling their wares just like normal. The priests are performing their usual daily rituals at the temple. People are walking the streets as if nothing special or unusual were happening at that moment. This utter normalcy must have absolutely gobsmacked them. You see, they had probably done this several times. Some star or heavenly event portended the rise of a new king or ruler, and so they would sit down and do the math, figure out where it was, and then go there as emissaries to this new administration. And when they arrived, there would always be something happening. Either the old king was still alive and defending his throne against the usurper, so there was bloodshed in the streets. Or maybe the transition of power was peaceful, but in that case there was also something different. There was a collective and heavy sigh of relief from the citizens of the city. Hey, no civil war, no death squads. We get to rejoice. And in those cases, the people would have feasted for days and danced in the streets at a peaceful transition of power. But these magi, these sorcerers, show up in Jerusalem and nothing. No stench of carnage, but no aroma of peaceful celebration either. Just normal. Now, magus, plural magi, is a Greek word meaning wise one, diviner, or sorcerer, and the root of the English word magic. In the ancient world, a magus was a kind of combination of advanced mathematician, astrologer, political scientist, and trusted advisor to kings and rulers. The motions of heavenly bodies like stars and planets were thought to both influence and predict earthly events. So these magi were using the most advanced mathematics known to humans at the time to figure out things like, would the crop be bountiful this year or would there be a drought? Would the king be successful in his spring military campaign or would there be heavy losses? Would there be some kind of attempted coup d'etat, and would that succeed? You can imagine the kind of tension inherent in the job of being a magus. Because on the one hand, you are a mathematician and a scientist, or the closest thing the ancient world had to a scientist, doggedly seeking the truth. On the other hand, you work for kings and governors who have agendas and egos. So Magi needed to tread very carefully between the worlds of knowledge and politics. In the mid-1960s, there was a scientist, a geochemist, named Claire Cameron Patterson. And he was working on the problem of finding out the precise age of the Earth. And in order to do this, he had taken a meteorite, and he was trying to do an analysis of some of the zircon crystals inside this meteorite. And he started running tests, but every time he ran a test, he would get wildly different results as to the age of the Earth. So he was wondering, is it the instruments? Is it this? Is it that? It took him a long time to figure out what was causing these massive shifts in results. He finally figured out that it was lead, little particles of lead in the atmosphere contaminating his instruments. And so in that process, he realized, well, I have to create a clean room, a room where there is no lead in the air whatsoever. And this turned out to be much more difficult than he thought, too. It took quite a long time, but he did finally invent this clean room. But in the process of this, he figured out that there was a lot more lead in the atmosphere than was previously thought. The levels of lead in the atmosphere were dangerous to human health. Now, common products of the time like gasoline and paint used lead, and the companies that produced these products claimed that atmospheric lead levels were well within the parameters found in nature, that their factories did not put out significantly more lead into the atmosphere than was already there. Patterson had discovered that this was a bald lie. So lead levels were dangerously high, negatively affecting public health. He started a campaign to limit atmospheric lead, but he ended up being blackballed by the scientific community at the behest of these business interests, like large petroleum companies and paint companies. He did not recant his statements or waver in his quest, and eventually he was vindicated. And we know of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of such scientists and truth seekers throughout human history. Galileo was persecuted by the church for publishing evidence that the earth circled the sun. Andreas Vesalius was a great anatomist and considered one of the founders of modern medical science, but because he dared to dispute what was considered accepted medical knowledge of the time, he was also persecuted. We have story after story of scientists and other truth tellers being persecuted because the knowledge they discover threatens the political power of those in authority. I'm sure these magi knew this and were therefore on their guard when King Herod summoned them to speak with them. Now, Herod had already consulted with his chief priests and religious scholars to find out what the scriptures foretold about the birth of the Messiah. Messiah or Mashiach in Hebrew means anointed one. Christ in Greek means anointed one. And they told him in Bethlehem of Judea. So when Herod spoke to the Magi, he put on an act. He said he wanted to know where the new king had been born so that he too could go and do him reverence. Right, Herod? Yeah, right. Stepping down from the throne and accepting a new king of Judah. That sounds like him. Of course it wasn't. Notice that Herod also flatters the Magi. He butters them up. In the Greek, and I didn't see this in other translations I looked at, but he asked them or ascertained from them an exact sequence of the events leading to the star's manifestation. And of course, these Magi wouldn't have just seen a star in the sky and gone, oh, ooh. They would have been taking measurements and noting times and noting, which section of the sky it was in, what planets it was near, all the things that were moving and happening around it in the heavens. And I think many of us know this, if you want to get on someone's good side, find out what they love and ask them to talk about it in great detail. Herod asks these stargazers to nerd out over every step of their observations and calculations in a brilliantly manipulative attempt to get them on his side. And of course, Herod meant none of it. He had no interest in bowing down to a new king and could care less about astronomical calculations. He was a tyrant king. He was a puppet of the Romans and probably a sociopath on top of that. Just a few years before, for contrast, he had built a Greek-style city called Sepphoris on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. And the Jewish villagers there rose up against him and against this kind of forced cultural assimilation. Herod quashed that revolt brutally, sending Roman soldiers to kill and rape and terrorize the villagers. So in ancient days, kings would receive word from astrologers that a new ruler was rising and that another ruler or someone important would die soon. And so these kings or rulers would often decide to make their own destiny in a sense, and they would kill a high-ranking official to make sure that the prophecy was fulfilled, right? There is a story that the Roman Emperor Nero heard from the astrologer Balbillus that a new star was rising, and Nero had all the eminent men of state killed. And then, of course, Herod goes one step further and has children murdered when he hears about the anointed one being born. So most of the cultures of the ancient Near East revered these magi, their learning, their wisdom, their abilities for divination. But the Jewish people were different. The Hebrew Scriptures denounces such astrology as witchcraft in multiple places. Here's a passage from Isaiah chapter 47, verses 13 to 14. You are wearied with your many consultations. Let those who study the heavens stand up and save you. Those who gaze at the stars and at each new moon predict what shall befall you. See, they are like straw. The fire consumes them. They cannot deliver themselves from the power of the flame. No coal for warming oneself is this, no fire to sit before. Throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, magi are consistently depicted as evil. And this is one reason why I translated the word as sorcerers, because we tend to have sort of good thoughts when we hear about wise men or even the word magi. But sorcerers does have a little more of a sinister connotation, as it would have had to the original readers of this. Another example, when God called Moses to go to Pharaoh and show the power of the Lord to convince Pharaoh to liberate the Hebrew slaves, Pharaoh's sorcerers often did the same wonders, but by the power of evil rather than good. And God's law in the Torah, in Deuteronomy, is clear. In chapter 18, verse 14, although these nations that you are about to dispossess do give heed to soothsayers and diviners, as for you, the Lord your God does not permit you to do so. So it would have been utterly amazing to ancient Jewish ears that these magi, these pagan idolater sorcerers with their dark magic, found the Messiah before any other Jewish scholar, scribe, or prophet. Notice also that even though the Magi pay homage to the baby Messiah, they still return to their own countries, a very unkosher line of work, and presumably to their own religions. They do not convert, and Matthew does not criticize them for not converting. So the birth of Jesus became kind of an interfaith event. Pagan sorcerers and Jewish villagers gathered together around this special infant and recognized God's light in him long before anyone ever conceived of a new religion called Christianity. So these magi, these sorcerers, after leaving Herod's palace, they journey on, they follow this star, using their charts as well as their new knowledge of these strange scriptures belonging to a foreign people to them. And night after night, they're probably pulling out their instruments, rudimentary spyglasses, basic measuring tools like a compass, traveling and calculating and traveling and calculating for days on end. And finally, one night, the star stops and stands. The position is exact. The timing is precise. And they delighted with their great joy. And I want to pause and take a moment to savor the joy, because when we talk of the Christmas story, we take the joy for granted. This verse, chapter 2, verse 10, again, I tried to render it a little more literally from the Greek. They rejoiced with an exceedingly great joy. Matthew repeats this joy root, rejoiced and joy, and he uses this very strong adjective and adverb, exceedingly great. And this is the only time in the Christmas story that Matthew ever describes anything close to joyful. Mary and Joseph's relationship is strained when Joseph thinks she's been impregnated by somebody else before their wedding. The angel appears and tells Joseph that the child is God's son, that he should accept Mary as his wife and raise the boy as his own. And Joseph follows the angel's command obediently, but Matthew reports no joy in any of it. No Mary bursting into spontaneous song as in the Gospel of Luke. No Joseph being joyfully relieved. There's not even a description of joy among any people of Jerusalem when they see these magi coming, supposedly because there's a new king of the Judeans. So Matthew's account of the birth of Jesus is conspicuously lacking in joy, except here, except with the magi. We have to understand what this joy would have meant to the early Christians hearing this story for the first time. Matthew was writing to a small group of predominantly Jewish Christians living in a world where most Jews did not believe Jesus was the Messiah, but in a world where this newfangled sort of Jesus movement, Jesus worship, was all the rage among Gentiles. So for Matthew's Jewish Christian community, it would have been scandalous to hear a story where pagan sorcerers were the ones who not only found the Messiah, but got to experience all the joy of it. Not only were they Gentiles, but their magic, their astrology, called idolatry and abomination in the Hebrew Bible, is never criticized by Matthew. The fact that their magic actually worked, actually predicted Jesus' birth better than the Jewish scholars, that would have been a hard pill for Matthew's audience. Now, this joy doesn't necessarily last very long in Matthew's story. The Magi stay long enough to give the baby their symbolic gifts, gold for kingship, frankincense for priesthood, and myrrh, the ancient version of embalming fluid symbolizing death and sacrifice. But no sooner have they arrived and popped open their treasure stores than they receive a dream telling them to return home by a different road. They defy Herod, an act of intellectuals engaging in civil disobedience, which, of course, happens sometimes, hopefully. But they were magi after all, and half their job was knowing when a king might get in the mood to kill them. So joy is more than happiness. Joy is transcendent. Joy finds that one moment of delight in the midst of darkness and danger. And joy is meant to be shared and appreciated even beyond boundaries of Jew and Gentile, of faithful and unfaithful. Matthew's readers would have resented the Magi their joy because of who they were and what kind of work they did. But I think that was Matthew's point. So we need to relish each other's joy, even when it seems like it's wrong. And everyone else in the story denied themselves that joy of discovering Emmanuel, God with us, God's presence made manifest in this wondrous and unexpected way. But we need to embrace that joy. In our modern world, there are still scientists and truth seekers who risk everything for that kind of joy. I think of the researchers who worked for years on mRNA technology, who now know that they laid the foundations for the current vaccines that have saved potentially millions of lives. So we are also called to find joy in the search for truth, as the Magi did all those centuries ago, as Claire Patterson did some 60 years ago, and as scientists, scholars, poets, and theologians continue to do today. We know that the powers and principalities of the world will not always like the truths we uncover. However, we must continue to strive for truth, to fight against lies and misinformation, and even to disobey authorities who would abuse this knowledge for their own power and ego. Again, just as the Magi did with Herod. Like scientists and sages of the past, we may suffer for our devotion to the truth, but it will also bring us joy. This Epiphany, may we find deep joy in discovering the fresh ways that God wondrously and mysteriously is present in our midst. Amen. Let's see, I think I have a few more. Turn to prayers. I see a few prayer requests here. Randy Pease has joined us. Jane Staten says daughter Rebecca has COVID, so prayers for her. Helen Templeton says prayers for her for pain relief for her. She's having an awfully hard time. I know Sean Craddock injured her knee. Was it yesterday or today? So lift up Sean in prayer for quick healing for her knee. Bill Lafife, I know, is not feeling well also, so prayers for Bill. And I believe there are a lot of folks who need traveling mercies, especially because of the weather right now. There are a lot of snowstorms and inclement weather all around the country. And so a lot of folks who had planned to travel through it are either delaying those travel plans or trying to keep those travel plans despite the danger. So keep all of those folks in prayer also. Are there other prayer requests?
I asked that we keep Brittany in a prayer request. She has breakthrough COVID and is quite sick.
Jane Johansson lifts up Brittany Westbrook, who has breakthrough COVID infection and is quite sick. So we continue to keep Brittany in our prayers.
I also asked prayers for Brenda McFarlane, Paige's mother-in-law, who is in the hospital with pneumonia.
Also, prayers for Brenda McFarlane, who is Paige's mother-in-law and is in the hospital with pneumonia, you said? No, with pneumonia. So prayers for Brenda. Yeah.
My brother-in-law Wayne, I think this week he'll be starting his treatment for his brain cancer.
So Karen lifts up her brother-in-law Wayne, who will begin treatment for brain cancer this week. Any others? Okay. Well, let us go to God in a spirit of prayer. God, in the midst of darkness, we long to see your light, whether in a star in the heavens, or a candle lit on a table, or in acts of kindness done, sometimes secretly, one person to another. God, we have lifted up many names of people who need your healing and your comfort. We lift up Helen that her pain may be eased. We lift up those who are infected with COVID, that their recovery may be swift and that the pandemic as a whole may die down, that people will take more safety precautions and will keep the virus from spreading. So we lift up Rebecca, we lift up Brittany, and all others who are infected. We lift up Wayne in prayers for him as he begins treatment for this brain cancer. May the wisdom of the doctors and nurses and specialists be with him to work toward his healing. We lift up Sean and her knee, and may she be healed quickly. And we ask traveling mercies for all of those who find that they are waylaid or delayed or are still trying to travel through bad weather in dangerous conditions. God, in this time of year and especially in this season of pandemic, we just ask that your presence be made known in ways small and great, that we see those stars, that we find those truths, that we know that you are present with us, Emmanuel, because it is in his name, Jesus, your Son, that we pray all of these things. Amen. Now we come to a time for sharing gifts. So we'll pass the basket for financial gifts to support Patchwork. And then we can also share gifts among ourselves that have happened over the last week or so. Nils lifts up that having his family visit over Christmas was wonderful and a gift, so indeed we give thanks for that. Looking to see any other gifts to share. Well, I will give thanks for the gift of Patchwork being closed this past week so that we don't have to come into work and we get a little bit of a break from that. So, yeah, Jane. Jane lifts up Jill Heminger again, having to write 2 obituaries within a fairly short amount of time of each other is a heavy burden, is a task. And so we give thanks for Jill. Well, for all of these gifts spoken and kept silent on our hearts, we are grateful and give God thanks. We now come to a time for celebrating communion. So if you are joining us online, please gather your elements, and we will also be celebrating here. Because when Jesus gathered with his disciples in that upper room, it was a different sort of knowledge and a different sort of epiphany and a different sort of journey that he would be sending them on. But he said, this knowledge of who I am and my relationship with God, and therefore your relationship with God, this is something that needs to be shared with the world. In acts of breaking and sharing bread, in acts of pouring and sharing wine. And as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you gain a kind of knowledge that is beyond intellectual knowledge. That is the knowledge of what it means to love, what it means to sacrifice for each other, what it means to serve each other, and ultimately then what it means to enter into a completely new kind of life. And I think his disciples didn't really understand at that moment at the table, but in looking back, I think they realized the truth of what he was saying. And when they went on their journeys to spread the gospel, spread the good news, they kept this ritual because they knew that this was a way of disseminating that knowledge, that mystical knowledge, that spiritual knowledge that you can't just know in your head, but you have to literally take into yourself to comprehend. And so it was on the night that he was betrayed that Jesus gathered in the upper room with his friends, his disciples. And he took bread, and after giving thanks for it, he blessed it, and he broke it. And he said, "Take and eat. This is my body broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me." And after supper, in like manner, he took the cup, and he said, "Drink of this cup, all of you, for poured out in this cup is the new covenant in my blood, shed for the forgiveness of sins." For those of you who are here in person, I invite you to come forward, and you can sanitize your hands here. And I've broken off pieces of bread here. Take a piece of bread, take a cup. The wine is on the red tray. The juice is on the table. And because Jesus sets this table and invites us to it, we can put no boundaries around it. It is an open table, and everyone is welcome. Come to the feast. So I missed this during the gifts time, but Helen Templeton lifts up Jean, her faithful presence all along this hard time for her. So we also give thanks for Jean as a gift to Helen, but also to all of us. Are there announcements for the good of the community? Patchwork will reopen tomorrow morning. We hope. With Sean's knee, she won't be here, so we're going to be a bit short. So we'll see how the morning goes tomorrow. The children's program doesn't start back until Tuesday, though. The schools don't start till Tuesday, so children's program starts on Tuesday. Any other announcements? Okay. Well then, that concludes our service of worship. Thank you for joining us here and online. May God bless us, and let the people of God say, Amen.